for a couple of months, and now we're back. We do a little short teaching, and then we show some videos that speak into our teaching and what's going on in the headlines, both news, politics, finance, anything going on that really is talked about in prophecy. So anyway, I'm going to read from Matthew 24 in verse 3. It says, "And now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be?'" That first question has to do with Jerusalem becoming desolate and the temple being taken down in verse 2. So Jesus was with his disciples in the Temple Mount, and he said to them, "Not one stone will be left upon another." Earlier, or late in chapter 23, he talks about Jerusalem and the rejection and the judgment that's coming upon Jerusalem. So that first question, when will these things be, that actually occurred in 70 AD. So the second question is, and what will be the sign of your coming? Now he's sitting right in front of them. And so they're talking about his second coming. They're thinking millennial reign. They're thinking his rulership over the earth and all things coming into subjection to him. And then what will it be like at the end of the age, at the end of this dispensation? So Jesus answers in verse 4. He said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you." So first words out of his mouth were, be warned, don't let anyone deceive you. In other words, there's going to be plenty of opportunity for deception. "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am Christ,' and will deceive many." So there'll be many coming in the name of Jesus that will bring deception. This is speaking about churches. This is speaking about Christian groups here on the earth. So when you look at this, he's saying, beware, the deception isn't coming out of the church or Christian labeled organizations. It's coming from within Christian labeled organizations, and many will be deceived by it. He says, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass." So Jesus is saying, here's a sign. You're going to hear wars, and you're going to hear rumors of wars. So there's going to be wars, and there's going to be rumors of wars. Don't be troubled by it, for these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be famine, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. So the word sorrows there is birth pangs, meaning when a woman goes into labor, she has contractions, she has pains. And those labor pains become more consistent. They become more frequent as they get closer and closer to the birth. So what Jesus is telling them here, he took something from the human experience, and he said, as my return comes closer and closer, you're going to have more wars and more rumors of wars, more famine, more pestilence, and more upheaval in nature. Now those four events are all God's judgment. Whenever he performed judgment or brought judgment throughout the Bible in the Old Testament, we see that it was a combination of one or all of those events. Several times in Scripture, he talks about or has brought wars or brought occupying armies into his people, Israel. But he said these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, the rest of chapter 24, I don't want to study today. It goes into another section. There's 4 sections. So verse 9 starts with, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. You will be hated by all nations for my name's sake." So we go from wars and rumors of wars, famine, pestilence, and earthquakes. Those will continue until his feet touch the earth and become more intense and more frequent. And then in verse 9, there's another section, another sign, where the earth and all of the nations of the earth hate Christianity, true Christianity, not labeled Christians, not those that don't live their faith or see through the eyes of the Bible and see through the eyes of Jesus being their Lord and Savior. Those that actually live the life, have the Bible as their compass, their moral compass here on earth, live according to the Word of God and obey the Word of God. The nations of the earth will hate them because they view them as not tolerant, not compromising, not allowing people to live the way they want to live. And it'll be turned from those that actually love them, because we as Christians, even though we have that paradigm, we love them. it'll be turned into hatred because we're not tolerant. We don't want them to marry who they want to marry. That's that part of it. Today I want to focus on wars because I think the world has taken a shift. And let's go through a little bit of history. After the Nazis attempted what they attempted in the Second World War, coming out of the Second World War, the world came to a place where we had the United Nations, we started NATO, we started the International Monetary Fund, we started a process whereby the world would play by certain rules. And so we had a Cold War, and NATO was set up for that. And we essentially, Russia and the democracies, the Western European democracies in the U.S., split up Europe and divided it. And so we know that there was a West Germany, East Germany, and we had this Cold War, and basically Russia fell apart in the early 90s. And because they fell apart, it left us, the world dominating authority. And so we lived under this status quo, and even though we had the Cold War, there was mutual destruction with nuclear weapons, and so everything was pretty much in check, and we played this game. When Russia fell in the early 90s, and we took over essentially as the only world superpower, that began to change with, number one, we made an agreement, and you're going to see in the videos today, we made an agreement with Russia. When Gorbachev and Baker and Bush and then Clinton, we made an agreement that we would not expand NATO east. In other words, Russia wanted an assurance that the buffer nations that touch their borders would never go into NATO. They needed that assurance, and we gave it to them. And that's part of the reason why I think Putin invaded Ukraine. I'm not legitimizing it. I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying that was the provoking measure that Ukraine was going to join NATO. And so when you look at what's happened between the early 90s and today, we have Russia who doesn't want NATO on its border. And you'll see some video clips about that today. And then we have China, who has emerged as a superpower. I mean, we still look at them as a developing nation. They are a superpower now. I mean, they have built a navy that rivals us. And so between Russia and China, and then take Iran and other nations, we have two organizations, one called the BRIC nations, which include Russia, China, Iran, and others that are basically enemies of our way of life. And then we have the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, which includes a lot of those same nations. Now, these nations have come against the dollar. They have set up trading agreements where the U.S. dollar is not the reserve currency as it was. After World War II, the U.S. dollar became the world reserve currency so that all commodity prices were priced against the dollar. So a barrel of oil was priced against the U.S. dollar. So if you were any nation in the world, friend or foe, you would have to have U.S. dollars to transact for commodities. And so we became the world reserve currency, and that gave us a lot of economic privilege. We were able to print money on demand. We were able to use credit on demand because there had to be a tremendous amount of liquidity with the U.S. dollar to transact. So now we have major sections of the world like China and India and Russia, Iran, South Africa, Brazil, Venezuela, North Korea, all of these nations, and even some of our allies like United Arab Emirates and others using their own currencies and not using the dollar. And I'm not talking about economics today, but that presents a major issue for our dollar and our markets if that continues to grow. So what we have is the world splitting again into two factions. Now we have three hot wars either started or ready to start. One is in Israel. Hamas has invaded Israel They're a surrogate of Iran. And we see Turkey and Iran and Russia and Syria really on the threshold of joining this war. We see Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so Israel now has major enemies. There's a hot war on two of its borders, and I see this escalating into something much bigger. So when you look at that section of the world, we are their allies. And Iran shot 600 missiles or drones at Israel, and we didn't fire back. And I think that was wrong. And so the world is becoming more emboldened to not listen to the U.S. and to come against any warnings that the U.S. might have. Under several presidents, we've drawn red lines and neglected to enforce them. And so Israel now, I think, from a prophetic standpoint, what we just read, that Jerusalem and the temple would be taken down, part of prophecy is that Israel became a nation in 1948, and then in 1967 they took the West Bank, which included Jerusalem, and so now the prophetic clock is running, and so we may see what I call the Ezekiel 38 war and the formation of it happening now. But be assured that Russia is in Syria, China is backing Iran and now Turkey has joined in, and so Israel is surrounded, and that's a big prophetic thing. That's number one. Number two, we have a hot war in Ukraine, and we've not handled it correctly from the beginning. At first, we thought that Ukraine would be taken over by the Russians in 30 days. Well, they've done something that defied, political gravity, is they've lasted this long. So we've given them just enough armaments to stay alive. We haven't given them the armaments to win. And so this last week, I think a major trigger point happened where Joe Biden and his administration and France and other nations are allowing the weapons that they're giving to Ukraine to go into Russia. Until now, they can only use them to defend themselves. And now they're using them as not only defense but offense, and they're striking in Russia, just a certain province. But this is driving us closer to World War III. I mean, this is dangerous. When you look at Putin, he didn't want nations that touch his borders. Gorbachev and Putin was a part of that team, didn't want anything on their borders. They wanted countries on their borders that weren't a part of NATO. And because China leaked it, that Ukraine was going to get fast-tracked into NATO, that broke him, and that started this process. And so we have this push toward World War III. I mean, if he feels threatened enough, he may, take action that we don't want to see, some sort of nuclear action. But here's the thing: Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey, and Syria, just as Ezekiel 38 laid out, they're moving toward the next moves militarily. Our current administration is somewhat passive. We don't want to escalate it into a larger conflict. There's differences of public opinion, but here's the thing. China has surrounded Taiwan 2 weeks ago. They surrounded them completely. And it's a dry run because I believe that Taiwan and China are going to escalate. So whoever's the president, whatever you are, Democrat or Republican, next administration, I think, is going to walk into a world that may be at war. And that's one of the signs, and war will bring famine, and war will bring pestilence, and, COVID was pestilence. And so I think that prophetically, we're entering this phase where there's wars and rumors of wars. We may have 3 hot conflicts that we're a part of, and in 2 of them, we promised to defend Israel, and we promised to defend Taiwan. The question is, will we? Will we really? What's our response time to China and Taiwan? It'll be over in a week. What's our response time? Why haven't we really responded to Israel? Why haven't we set them back on their heels? And so this, I believe, is part of what God spoke about as far as, I believe, judgment on the earth and judgment in nations. And so the world is conforming right now to prophecy. And that's what we're doing here today. So I have some videos, there's I think 3 or 4. Just watch through them and then we'll be back after that.
Just before his army invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin outlined his motivations in a speech. His first and main argument,
имея в виду расширение блока НАТО на восток.
NATO's expansion. He blamed the extensions of the military alliance ever closer to Russia's borders and accused Western leaders of breaking alleged promises to never do so.
В этом ряду и обещание нашей стороне не расширять ни на 1 дюйм НАТО на восток.
But experts disagree on whether that's true.
The U.S. broke these assurances and these commitments that had been made.
I think that's false. It's really sort of a pretext.
So was anything really promised? And why is that such a crucial point for Russia? After World War II, 2 spheres of influence emerged in Europe, each one with their military alliance. NATO in the west, countries that would soon be part of the Warsaw Pact in the east. This created a clear red line between the 2 superpowers. Their spheres of influence were clearly defined, and for many years NATO grew slowly. Until 1990, when that divide started to crumble here in Germany.
In Germany was the key focal point of the Cold War in Europe.
Joshua Shifrison has done extensive archival research on the US and Soviet foreign policy,
including this great question of what or was not promised in 1990.
At the time, Germany was speeding towards reunification. And for many in Europe, this was a bit scary.
The US did not want to see a reunified Germany either in the Soviet camp or neutral, right? And the concern with neutrality was that a neutral Germany might one day run amok.
Washington decided the best option was to bring Germany into NATO. But first, they had to convince the Soviets. And here we get to those famous assurances about NATO's expansion.
And in February of 1990, in a series of meetings, US and West German leaders very openly said that if the Soviet leadership consented to German reunification and reunified Germany remaining in NATO, then NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east.
Logs of those conversations have since been declassified, and they show what Soviet politicians were told by Western leaders like German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörner, and the famous words by US Secretary of State James Baker, not 1 inch to the east. So what happened to NATO after Germany unified? In 1999, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined NATO. In 2004, it was the Baltic states and 4 other countries. And finally, 4 more from 2009 to just a few years ago. Georgia and Ukraine were promised membership in 2008, but are not yet members. This seems to justify Putin's grievances, but one historical event could suggest a different interpretation.
Back in 1991 in the collapse of the Soviet Union.
This is Stephen Pfeiffer. He was the US ambassador to Ukraine when NATO was expanding, and deputy director on the Soviet desk when those assurances were made.
When Secretary Baker at that time was talking about NATO not extending forward, I understood that as not into East Germany.
Pfeiffer says that those commitments didn't refer to countries like Poland or Lithuania because...
At that time also, the Warsaw Pact still existed. The Warsaw didn't collapse for another year. So I saw the discussions about not 1 inch really in the context of Germany.
But many experts disagree.
That doesn't quite hold water for 2 different reasons. One is that the Soviet leadership and the Americans both understood that the question of what comes next in Europe was all about the future of Eastern Europe, not just East Germany. There's a concern that the Warsaw Pact is falling apart. And also, if I say to you, I'm not going east, it's a pretty generic statement, right? It kind of beggars the imagination to think that they only meant, east only there, but no further from there.
Pfeiffer, however, raises another point.
When you look at the actual agreements, there were no final commitments by NATO not to enlarge.
In other words, no treaties, only conversations.
Nothing was written down, as we've established, but at the same time, political understandings and commitments of this sort, diplomatic commitments, carry a lot of water in world politics. This is how we ended the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. And if it didn't matter, why would we have diplomats talk to each other?
Regardless of how serious these assurances were, this debate arguably misses a more important point.
States don't uphold treaties just because they're written down. If those leaders in those states decide to change course, then a treaty is not going to stand in the way. So all the emphasis on writing things down, it puts the cart before the horse.
NATO's expansion can be better explained by focusing not on those conversations, but on the countries involved. On one side, the US, whose influence grew after the fall of the Soviet Union.
NATO expansion was fundamentally a byproduct of the unipolar era, right? At this moment in time where the US had great power, very few constraints, and at least some policymakers who had an idea that American power and influence applied to the world would generate lots of goods for the United States as well as good things for the world.
On another, the countries that joined NATO.
It wasn't that NATO said, let's enlarge. It was you had countries such as Poland emerging from the wreckage of the Warsaw Pact saying, we want to be a member of NATO, we want to be a member of the European Union, and we are prepared to do all of the things that requires.
And finally, Russia, whose motivations are not limited to NATO.
I think there are really three reasons behind what Russia's doing. One is the geopolitical concern. The Russians want a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, and Ukraine is a very important part of that. So they're trying to bring it back. But there are two other issues at play here. One, I think, is a domestic political concern, and that is for the Kremlin, a Western-oriented, democratic, economically successful. That kind of Ukraine is a nightmare for the Kremlin because it leads to Russians asking, why can't we have the same political voice and the same democratic rights that they have in Ukraine? And then there's a third reason, which I just think it's Vladimir Putin. And he's quite emotional about Ukraine. He's very emotional and even angry about it.
Whether NATO should have kept its assurances is up for debate.
We underestimated just how much antipathy there was in Moscow to NATO's existence.
Years of the U.S. downplaying the assurances that were previously given and making Russia feel like it could not trust the West have really narrowed the opportunity to resolve this crisis.
But it's really sort of a pretext. Mr. Putin has put together this list of grievances against the West, but he didn't talk about them 20 years ago.
But those discussions were important not only for what they promised, but also for what they showed. A willingness to compromise and to not cross each other's red lines.
Israel's war on Hamas has spilled beyond Gaza's borders, inflaming regional tensions and causing onlookers to wonder, is this about to spark a third world war?
These are war games on an overwhelming scale.
Funerals of soldiers killed in Ukraine have become a daily occurrence.
This is truly a crisis waiting to happen.
Israel's fighting Hezbollah, Iran and Iraq are mad, and the US has its fingies in the pie. China wants Taiwan, and Putin wants to reunite the USSR. This is about NATO. The first international organizations were formed in the wake of World War II to maintain global stability and avoid future wars. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, have not managed to secure lasting global peace and prosperity per se, but they have successfully established a world order with the US and its European allies at the tippity top. We'll talk more about the UN a little later because that is basically the most intense high school cafeteria of all time, but at least most countries get seats there. Not so with NATO. NATO is the exclusive club for Western democracies. It's basically the plastics of international relations. And we're Regina George. Even though the West had teamed up with the USSR to win World War II, they were still very much terrified of communism. So NATO was formed by the democracy-loving Allied powers to counter the challenge still posed by the Soviet Union. One of the most important things to know about NATO is Article 5 of its charter, which translates to, you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. The US isn't the only country with nuclear weapons, but we do have more of them than everyone else. And we're the only ones who've been sick enough to use them, just twisted enough to not be trusted. So the nuclear aspect, coupled with our obscene military spending year over year, has made US-led NATO a formidable and highly successful alliance. One which theoretically could have disbanded in 1991 after its primary opponent, the Soviet Union, was defeated. Instead, NATO has only grown, adding former Eastern Bloc countries as members and solidifying the hold of Western-style democracies around the world. Unfair. And having spent the better part of a century forced to bend to Western will, some of the more ambitious countries we've marginalized are coming together. They each have distinct goals, but a common purpose temporarily unites them: dismantling the current world order and unseating the US as the dominant global power. So if at any point you're like, wait, why are they even doing this? Just return to that core hatred of the West and you'll be sufficiently reoriented. All right, so who hates us the most? Let's start with an oldie but a goodie. Mother Russia. Vladimir Putin spent the first 15 years of his career as an intelligence officer in the KGB, Russia's infamous secret police force. In 1998, he became director of the Federal Security Service, or FSB, the KGB's domestic successor agency. Putin's political power expanded quickly from there. In 1999, he was appointed prime minister. In 2000, he was elected president, a role he held until 2008, when Russian law required him to take a term off. There is no limit on how many terms a president could serve, but no more than 2 terms could be consecutive. Putin's early years were a golden age for Russian relations with the West, at least from the West's perspective. Putin was playing ball with the capitalists. He agreed to build a pipeline to feed Europe his delicious oil, and he'd honored the Constitution and stepped down when his 2 consecutive presidential terms were up. Sure, this guy may have orchestrated terror attacks on his own people to gain public support for his administration, but things could be a lot worse. At one point in 2001, President George W. Bush even hosted Putin at his Texas ranch, saying he looked into the man's eyes and could see into his soul. Now that's ironclad foreign policy if you ask me. 2 bros gazing into each other's soul windows? What could go wrong? Leaders in the West were very eager to believe that Putin was going to behave like one of us, a capitalist who wouldn't risk oil revenues on acts of aggression. It's a classic mistake, assuming your opponents share your worldview. And it was a miscalculation that would very soon bite us in the ass. Putin sees himself as the next great czar of the Russian Empire, and his driving ambition is to restore his nation to its former glory. And I'm not even talking about USSR glory days. He apparently thinks those guys were clowns. I'm talking about Putin sees himself as heir to Peter the Great, the first emperor of Russia, hence his obsession with reunifying historically Russian lands. In 2014, just a few years after the start of his 3rd presidential term, Putin tested his goodwill with the West by illegally annexing Crimea. Remember that? In response, the West was pretty permissive, urging Kyiv to proceed with utmost caution. This underwhelming response had disastrous consequences, helping to convince Putin that the West ultimately lacked the resolve to confront him. In 2020, Putin changed the constitution to remove limits on presidential terms. Very convenient. In 2022, he started the war with Ukraine. And in March of this year, Putin won an improbable 87% of the popular vote, securing his 5th term as president. But it's not just Putin. Removing term limits is a classic authoritarian power move, and China's president did it too. In 2018, China's parliament amended its constitution, eliminating the 2-term limit for presidents. During that same Congress, the party also voted to enshrine President Xi Jinping's name and political ideology into the constitution, elevating him to a status not achieved since Chairman Mao himself.
In another major story we're watching today, there's been a major change in U.S. policy on arming Ukraine, in particular how the weapons that Washington provides are used. For the first time, the White House will allow some U.S. weapons to be used to strike inside Russia. For more on that now, I'm joined by Nick Schifrin. So Nick, tell us, what did the president decide?
For the last 2 years, President Biden has had 2 goals in Ukraine, not necessarily complementary. One, to try and prevent Russia from taking over Ukraine and therefore send U.S. weapons and money into Ukraine. The second is to avoid direct U.S.-Russia confrontation, and that led him to restrict the use of those U.S. weapons so that Ukraine could not fire them into Russia. But in the last few weeks, some 30,000 Russian troops gathered on the border, bombarded Ukrainian towns like this one in the Kharkiv district, and seized 12 villages around the buffer zone, or what Russia's trying to create is a buffer zone. They've also bombarded Kharkiv city, the second largest city in Ukraine, despite the fact that Ukrainians were watching the Russian troops gather right on the border and launch this attack that everyone knew was coming, and yet Ukraine couldn't use those weapons to try and prevent it. And so a U.S. official confirms tonight, quote, the president recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine is able to use U.S. supplied weapons for counter-fire purposes in the Kharkiv region so Ukraine can hit back. Kharkiv region is part of this statement. The U.S. official who told me went on to say our policy with respect to prohibiting the use of long-range strikes inside Russia has not changed.
A very specific guidance there. But Nick, this didn't happen in a vacuum. There's been a lot of international pressure on President Biden. What do we know about that?
The British government lifted its restrictions a month ago. This past week, the French President Emmanuel Macron and the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg also said that Ukraine should be allowed to use Western weapons to fire into Russia. But a U.S. official tonight said that President Biden actually made his initial decision on this 2 weeks ago, May the 15th. And so clearly the international pressure has increased, but the U.S. decided this before that happened.
Great.
Let's move on now to Ukraine. This is actually a much more serious situation that broke over the weekend. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. Biden has now secretly given Ukraine permission to strike inside of Russian territory with U.S. weapons. This previously reversed more than 2 years of U.S. policy, and it was directly allowing Ukraine to strike inside of Russia using U.S.-provided weapons, including long-range missiles, which previously had been off limits for the Ukrainians. The reason why the Ukrainians are begging for this is that they are suffering major defeats and reversals on the battlefield. Russia has already, just in the last several months, taken more territory than the entire Ukrainian counteroffensive that was supposed to materialize such incredible gains. I also want to make clear that the change in this policy does not apply to is not just U.S.-provided weapons being allowed to be used in Crimea. We are talking about Russian borders that have been well and long acknowledged by both the United States, by Ukraine, and the international community. The Ukrainians allowing this, Ukrainians pushing for this, again, because of their shortages of manpower and of their reversals on the battlefield, and the obvious lesson that in a war of attrition, which they are in and they committed themselves to, they are going to lose. And they are doing their absolute best to gamble as much as they can while basically trying to bring the United States into this war. And that is the most devastating part of this. And just to show you what is life like in Ukraine, why is this happening right now? Let's put this up there on the screen. I'm going to talk over this. This is a video, just came out yesterday. Here you can see, which is not a young man. I mean, this is a graying, like older gentleman being kidnapped off of the street for conscription because he had been avoiding the draft, plucked. He's going to be taken directly to a center. He's going to be recruited into the military, forcibly conscripted. He's going to have weapons in his hands before you know it. And lo and behold, doesn't take a genius to see that people like this, where the average age is some 40, 50 years old, who even knows now at this point? Let's put this up there. It shows us that the basic training, so-called amazing training run by the United States government here, basic training is, quote, barely covering the basics. Even Ukraine's own commanders in the field say they are bracing for most of the new troops under a conscription law to arrive with poor training. So it turns out, Crystal, that whenever you forcibly kidnap and conscript, like all of these old men, force them through basic training with subpar weapons, barely even knowing how to operate, knowing that they're likely marching to their deaths, that they are not going to be fighting effectively. So this is the most dangerous situation all around, and it has already revived the recent threats of tactical nuclear weapons. The threats from the Russians have come from the highest level, from Putin and from Dmitry Medvedev. And of course, the response is, well, they've never done it before. It's like, well, you only have to be wrong once. Yeah. And this is single-handedly the most dangerous escalatory situation in Ukraine since the beginning of the entire war. And yet it's like the media, everybody else is celebrating it. Just the last thing I want to add here, I found this out this morning, I'm honestly repulsed by it, is that Zelensky will be honored at D-Day celebrations in France, where Russia was explicitly not invited, even though Soviet troops had a major role, some would say the highest role, in actually defeating the Hitler regime. And Zelensky just recently honored a literal Nazi at the an SS Nazi at the Canadian Parliament. We are excluding Russia here from the D-Day celebration, which they'd always been a part of, even during the whole Soviet Union. The entire idea was, hey, yeah, we're not getting along now, but we came together and we beat Hitler. Let's at least celebrate a little bit of that and honor the men who died on that day. We're turning it into this repulsive game where we're looking at Ukraine as important as an occupied France in the 1940s. So all of the everything is set right now. From the NATO powers who want to put their troops inside of Ukraine, the Russians want to use tactical nuclear weapons, the Biden administration basically sleepwalking us now to this situation. And there's no outrage, in the American public because they don't really understand still the stakes. It's all all the risks have been hidden from them and the truth about this conflict.
Well, welcome back. As you can see, our country changes its leadership every 4 years. And so the people that made those promises, they're gone. And so I don't give Putin he's evil. He kills his enemies. He's formed a dictatorship. But let's not provoke this, by shooting missiles into his territory. So we have to draw our troops into Ukraine and push them out. And we get into something that spreads conflict throughout the world. We're going to see a world war, and I think we will see it before the end of this decade. So anyway, that's Headline and Prophecy. This is every Monday at 10 o'clock. We stream it live. I pre-record it, but it's streamed live so that it's not on their platform, so they can't censor it before I put it up. Please share this. What happens is if they censor me, they shut down sharing and they shut down liking. Share this as soon as you listen to it so that it expands. We expand into other Facebook accounts so they can, send it out. And then pray about supporting us. We're a ministry, I believe, that's called for this time. We have several curriculums, which include workbooks and DVDs and downloadable videos and books. We don't merchandise anything. Everything's free for us. If you go to our website, watchersoftruth.com, you'll see we have 8 curriculums with workbooks. You can order 20 workbooks, and all you do is pay for shipping. We'll send it to you for free. And so please pray about joining us. We're praying for 400. You can give as little as 10, but we're praying for 400 new $25 a month or more donors to join us on our mission to bring knowledge. Now, we have our uncensored blog, which is emailed to our database every Friday morning. It's called What I Really Think. It's this on steroids. I name names and I go into things that social media would not tolerate. And so we email that to those in our database. So if you become a free member, you go to our website and you don't have to give. Just give us your name and email address. We don't sell that. Give it to another. All we do is we'll send you 3 emails a week, 2 sets of notes in our blog, and you'll receive that in your email every Friday morning. It's also on our handheld device and our website. So pray about becoming a partner. Pray about joining us. Certainly go to our website and become a member so that you'll get newsletters and other things from us. So God bless you and thanks for watching today. Have a